After recovering from COVID, we left Fairbanks in our rear view, turned south, and headed towards Denali National Park. About 45 minutes out of Fairbanks, we made a stop at Skinny Dick's Halfway Inn. It's probably best described as a roadhouse, bar, and adult humor store halfway between Fairbanks and Nananu.
Happy early birthday, Bob.
After picking up an off-color sweatshirt for Kelly's mom, we were back on the road. We met up with our friends Caryn and Beau at a campground that adjoined 49th State Brewing in Healy, about 15 miles from Denali. They have a great outdoor area with games, a stage, and something familiar.
This is the bus from the Into the Wild movie. Different from the actual bus number 142 that we showed from the Museum of the North.
Although only a movie prop, it did contain authentic postcards like this ominous foreshadowing of the adventure ahead. It also contained photographs and copied journal entries chronologizing Chris McCandless's 114 days in Bus 142, ending with his plea for help before his subsequent demise. On a more positive note, Stormy got to meet new friends and all the tales were a wagon. And we got to hang out with Lee, Beau, Caryn, Kaitie, Kelly, and John, and share some pints to friends old and new. The next morning, we were off to Denali National Park, where we met back up with Lee and Kelly and Caryn and Beau. Established in 1917 and containing North America's tallest peak, Denali National Park and Preserve contains over 6 million acres of land and only 35.5 miles of official trails. We headed down the one road in the park towards the campground we would be staying at, but first we stopped for a hike on Mountain Vista Trail. With the overcast skies, we didn't have much of a mountain vista, but we did get to watch this little snowshoe hare hop by. As we continued our walk, the rain started coming down, potentially brought on from a rain dance by one of these former Seattleites. The rain cleared and we continued down the road, until being held up by this sheep crossing. We're not sure who taught them to tell time, but we gave them their full 10 minutes, then made our way to Teklanika Campground where we would be staying. And the first order of business was to put up the clam tent because the mosquitoes were pretty bad. The next morning we took Stormy for a walk around the campground, which is as far as he could go. Unfortunately for Stormy, pets are only allowed on the roadways and parking lots in Denali. For him, this was going to be a boring 4 days. Since personal vehicles aren't allowed beyond our campground, everyone piled into the bus and headed up the road. About halfway up the road, the bus driver had to slow for this guy. This swaggering brown bear had figured out that walking down the road was easier than through the thickets. The remainder of the drive was filled with beautiful scenery. The road now ends at mile 43, having been washed out by the Pretty Rocks landslide in August of 2021. Just after the turnaround, stairs were added to allow visitors access to the braided rivers. There are no trails here, just backcountry wilderness to explore on your own. Wanting to explore further, Lee and Kelly ditched their shoes and headed across the river. When asked, "Why did you climb that hill?" the only logical answer is because it was there. With that hill conquered, they headed back to the bus stop. On the bus ride back, they spotted this caribou hanging out in the last bit of July snow. The following day, Lee and Kelly and I headed out to explore Mount Margaret. We lucked out with a clear but windy day, and once above the tree line, we became one of the lucky 30%ers who get to see Denali in its glory. We must have taken an hour's worth of video, not knowing when the clouds would obscure the view.
We are coming to you live from the ring!
Each pitch offered an ever-changing view of this 20,310-foot peak.
Second fall summit, same as the first.
Finally, we reached the real summit of Mount Margaret.
How to get the shot with really windy conditions on top of a little mountain.
Although Denali stands head and shoulders above the rest, the remainder of the Alaska Range is pretty impressive on its own. As we took our last shots of Denali, Kelly and Caryn were back at the ranch, cross-stitching and quilting.
There's Denali! Woo! Made it, on our way down. Still beautiful.
I'm always intrigued by each area's different flora and fauna. Like this chirping Arctic ground squirrel. When we got to the bottom, Denali was still showing.
We're bound and determined to finish this.
And amazingly, they did. It was quite the quilt puzzle. The next day, Kelly and Caryn headed off on their own adventure, taking a hike along the Savage River Loop. The trail meanders up along the Savage River. And, like all of Denali, offers beautiful scenery. That night,
And Kelly wins. So close.
Yet so far.
we awoke to a beautiful day, said our goodbyes to Caryn and Beau, hitched up Picolino, caught one last glimpse of the tip of Denali, and headed on down the road, where these future sled dogs were getting some exercise.
Puppies in training.
Leaving the park, we turned south toward the Denali Highway. The Denali Highway is a 135-mile road with only 24 miles of it paved, but it offers some of the most breathtaking views of the Alaska Range.
And there's our rigs. It's pretty amazing. They're on a pullout on the Denali Highway, and we've said it before, but this view or the video will not do this justice. Not a bad view from my desk for work tomorrow.
The next day was as beautiful as the last. Stormy started off his morning on the right paw, with a view of this little guy out our window.
Is that the Arctic ground squirrel?
After all his meerkat posing, he decided he'd had enough and took off down the hill. After Kelly's workday, we headed across the Susitna River and started day 2 on the Denali Highway.
We're making a quick pit stop at Clearwater Creek.
I considered dropping a line in the water, but with a fast-moving river and lots of mosquitoes, we decided to just let Stormy take a little dip before we hit the road again. We pulled off on top of McLaren Summit to take a break and scope out a possible hike. The hike didn't pan out, so we enjoyed the view, then continued on towards Tangle Lakes Campground. They were out of sight, so we moved just beyond it to a spot that Lee and Kelly had found.
We're gonna try this. We've got quite the approach. Mosquitoes are ravenous. All right.
We made it in no problem and were rewarded with a beautiful view for the night and the next workday. After work, we broke down camp and headed back out on the road for our third and final day on the Denali Highway.
So this is day 3 of the Denali Highway driving? And what do we think? We're how many miles? We're 14 miles from the end.
Yeah, we're 121 or so miles into it. And the first coming from Denali. The best part was what they call
Chip seal.
Chip seal. That was actually pretty smooth. It had some potholes, but it was really good. Here on the last section, the last 20 miles into Paxton, where it's all paved, and the paved part is one of the slowest. We're doing 25 miles an hour right now, and I'm having to slow down.
Yeah, people rave about the paved section. They're like, oh, it's paved the last section.
Give me the chip seal any day.
It's been nothing but frost heaves.
But at least the scenery was still pretty nice. Coming to the end of the Denali Highway. At the end of the Denali Highway, we turned south and headed towards our next adventure on Route Glacier.
Life is a winding road,